Good afternoon or good evening. Welcome to this STARS webinar. I'm Tony Schönenberger. I'm the Executive Chairman of STARS. STARS is actually a platform for dialogue to discuss developments which will impact the society as a whole and our businesses in the next couple of years. No doubt, food innovation is such a megatrend. We are actually witnessing a revolution in the food sector with lots of innovation, such as plant-based meat, cultured meat, or synthetic biology, etc. And today we have the great pleasure to talk to Jan PACAS. Jan is the founder and CEO of All G Foods. We will hear about it in a minute. And I should also mention that Jan is a STARS alumnus. He attended the very first STARS symposium in Singapore back in 2014. So Jan, we are very much looking forward to your insights. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. I'd also like to introduce you now to our moderator, Tom Ludescher. Tom is an entrepreneur and an investor based in Singapore. And he, in addition to that, he's also co-president of the STARS Singapore Alumni Chapter. So Tom, once more, thank you very much for moderating. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Tony. Hello, everyone. Good morning to Europe. Good afternoon to Asia and good evening to Australia. I'm really happy to follow up with today's webinar on the series that we started with plant-based, then cell-based. Today, we talk about the very exciting technology, precision fermentation. My name is Tom Ludescher and I'm the co-chair of the STARS Singapore Alumni Chapter. And I have today here with me Jan PACAS, founder of All G Foods and alumnus of the first STARS Singapore Symposium back in 2014. That's actually the first time we met. In this webinar, we will talk about All G's journey as a pioneer in synthetic biology and how he and his team are driving the future of food through precision fermentation for the next generation of milk and meat products. Welcome, Jan, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tom, so much for the kind introduction, and also Tony and everyone on the webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Pleasure being here.
A quick note to all the participants of this webinar, you will have the opportunity to ask questions to Jan. Please use the chat function in the Zoom link that you have received for participating in today's webinar. Thank you. So Jan, tell us a bit more about precision fermentation and the science behind it, synthetic biology. This sounds all very new, very exciting. What is it about?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, and new, exciting, maybe for some people scary, because that's the feedback that we hear as well. And look, maybe I'll start very broadly first and then narrow it down to what does it mean for the future decades in terms of food innovation. So what's synthetic biology, right? We all heard about how we can sequence the human genome, which cost maybe 10, 15 years ago, $1 billion to get the line of code, which ultimately expresses us as human beings, who we are. And today, this to express a human genome doesn't cost $1 billion, but costs maybe $500. And in 300 million lines of code or numbers, I can exactly express who we are as human on a genome sequence. And of course, you know, we are complicated beings. So if we can sequence a human being, we can certainly also sequence much simpler molecules, whether it's proteins that we found in dairy, eggs, or whether it's different enzymes or proteins that are used in pharmaceuticals and so on. And the whole technology with the combination also of being integrated with machine learning and faster processing speed became simply so much more available and faster, where, you know, it existed in the last years in food production, or apologies, in pharmaceuticals production and in certain elements of food. But I think we're at the cusp of where we're going to see the price points where we can make, and this is not a replica, but identical products through synthetic biology or precision fermentation, because we're getting to the price points where this will take off. And I'll explain how much more sustainable and scalable that is. So synthetic biology, what it is, it's ultimately we can replicate, we take a genetic information from a protein, in our case, a milk protein, and we insert that genetic information, which is literally lines of numbers and code, into a yeast or into a bacteria, which becomes a microbe that basically becomes a mini cell factory. We feed it water and sugar, and that programmed microbe replicates itself and becomes a mini cell factory and growth at a very, very high speed. And a similar process, is used, a much simpler process in terms of brewing beer, where you imagine at large scale, we have a large stainless steel tank, and yeast turns certain inputs into beer. And so the difference, what we can do is, because we can engineer exactly what we want as a target product, be it milk, be it eggs, be it many, many other different proteins or products, we basically program those microbes or those small microbes into mini cell factories, and they create in a few days bioidentical proteins or molecules that we want. That's in essence, from a scientific kind of perspective, what we're doing.
That sounds very interesting. I understand it's not a completely new technology, so it's a proven and safe technology, but it's the first time that this is now shifting over from more medical use cases, like I think insulin is also produced this way.
Correct. So insulin is actually exactly being manufactured 90% through this technology today. And why this was the case, right? Insulin 30, 40 years ago had to be extracted from pancreas of pigs. And we did get very little percentages of target insulin, and we need to, unfortunately, kill many pigs, and the whole process was extremely slow and basically non-scalable. So somebody came up with this, well, if we just can create that target molecule through a better process, we can only, create the one small portion of what we need. And this process is used today to grow insulin, as an example, exactly as you say.
So you can do good with the technology on the medical side. And I think in food, there were even use cases like in cheese production, I think, where you also could choose between using your technology for producing the rennets or for basically looking after the calves, the baby cows. So that's another example where you manage basically to step away from using animals and going into something more synthetic, but still natural.
That's exactly true, right? And look, we're at the cusp of where different factors of disruption and lower price parity and availability of technologies at scale is allowing, where it was used in the past more as a niche application to really, I think driven by, on one hand, need, because we're having 6-7 billion people on the planet, and every 30 years we have doubled the demand on animal agriculture. Every 30 years, for the last 100 years, if you look back, every 30-35 years we've doubled demand on cows, right? And it was relatively easy to do so 50-60 years ago. We just added more land and more cows and so, but now suddenly we're running into problems because we don't have more farmable land. Even if you had to, you just don't add so many herds so easily. You have a lot of weather disruption. You have obviously, a huge creation of methane from animal agriculture, which cows are causing. And of course, given the climate targets that we have, we got to reverse that. So there's limits to what we can do. And that's where our technology can really solve this at scale.
So we have really an alternative for the real thing, because when we spoke, for instance, about plant-based, when you have an oat milk, then an oat milk will always be oat and not a cow's milk. But in your case, using your technology, you can have basically an identical twin of the real thing, but produced without really the need of having any animals being fed and farmed, with all the natural implications coming with it. So from a sustainability point of view, do you have any numbers of indication how much more efficient and environmental friendly your technology is compared with traditional dairy or meat production?
Yeah, so look, to kind of first point, yes, it is bioidentical, right? So you measure the proteins that we can do on the most advanced microscope and you get identical results. You then taste them, they taste the same, they have the same functionality and so on, right? And that's where personally I love oat milk myself, big fan, but it comes with limits. It comes with limits in terms of, for instance, using plant-based to produce cheese. don't get the same texture and stretchiness that we love particularly so much about the Swiss cheese, right? You just don't get there from plant-based cheese. And equally, from a nutritional value, plant-based cheese doesn't give you the proteins that you'd get from normal cheese. And lastly, of course, from a kind of sustainability point of view, to produce, for instance, almond milk is you actually using significantly more water than even through a traditional dairy process. So our technology is a game changer in multiple aspects, because so you get the same result. You get it, in fact, the end product can be, and that might be a scary word, but we can engineer it to be healthier, because we can only target the target proteins that are best for you, but we don't include the lactose, which 90% of people tend to be lactose intolerant. We can make it growth hormones free, and so on and so on. So we give the purest protein with the same delicious taste that we love about that, but at a fraction to the environment cost, right? And the fraction, it's a multiple of 10 or 15 times less land, water, 20 times less CO2. But most interestingly, it makes it, I'd still say the current, if you think how we buy cheese in a supermarket, right? And it's always there, but we don't think about how the supply chain can be actually disruptive. We don't think of, well, what if there's a 3 months of rain, which we had last year here in Australia? If we had so much rain that all the cows drowned and there was no farming available because we had just 4 months of rain. But then you have equally, you go back to the Middle East or certain parts of Europe, which the 4 months of rain is followed by 6 months of drought and absolutely no grass available. So you depend on external factors, you depend on people, you can't have diseases, you can have strikes, you can get animals that are, in a bad mood on a Saturday or a Sunday. So it's all a very, I'd say, shaky and not really perfectly scalable process. Whereas if we think about it, how the end product looks like, we put the programmed microbes into large bioreactors, and we can place them, whether it's Switzerland, next to every major city, whether it's the Middle East, where they never have cows, and particularly in today's year, where there's a disruption of the supply chain driven by the war in Ukraine, they very much depend on imports. So we can place it in the Middle East, we can place it anywhere. And the microbes and the system runs Monday to Sunday. There's no strikes. It's 24/7. They don't ask for overtime over, public holidays like Christmas. It is a perfectly scalable, very green way of making identical food that we like and that is healthy for us. And again, if you think 10, 15 years forward, imagine that all the slaughterhouses could be replaced. In every major kind of city, you'd have a large set of bioreactors, which in a very infinitely scalable way can supply food for millions of people.
So we see here we have really a way of doing the same thing, but with much more efficiency of land, with no animals needed. Water usage is always a very, very delicate point with water shortages worldwide. And last but not least, the carbon footprint that is significantly better, the way how you produce dairy compared with the traditional dairy industry. I mean, this all sounds almost too good to be true. I guess everywhere there is a flip side of it, or challenges. What are your biggest challenges that you are facing today?
Oh, it's a number of things, right? Like, first one is of course, if you think of the existing dairy industry, it's been around for hundreds of years. And for hundreds of years, you built assets that all exist today, are in place. And I always say, like, look, when in the 1920s, we suddenly, wanted to change from millions of horses on the streets to suddenly having the same streets, but being replaced by cars. This was not an easy thing, right? Because you needed the infrastructure of the supply of the fuel stations, of the repair stations, of just so many different things that we need to put in place. And so similar, we need bioreactors, they need financing, you need, the tool, there's no ingredients, but the fuel is sugar, which is actually a very cheap way of feedstock, sugar and water. There's regulatory challenges. Similarly, again, electric cars, self-driving cars in the future, while it works, it doesn't mean that it's automatically approved, right? So we are talking to regulators all around the world. Of course, no surprise, Europe tends to be the most conservative regulator all around the world. And not so much Switzerland, but certainly the European Union, France, Germany tend to take a more conservative approach than, for instance, Singapore, where we expect to launch a product next year, or the US also very, very soon. But look, I think this is all, I'd say these are all small things in the scheme of things where we're going to be in 10 to 15 years. I think the one, of course, that we got to manage is consumer adoption, where our view is, you know, because there's a and I'll say, look, consumer adoption, but also how do we work together with existing dairy companies? And I'd say I get two types of reactions. There's the innovative ones, like the innovative banks. I built a fintech before, and the innovative banks wanted to work with me because they saw that's the future, but the not less innovative banks wanted to shut me down. And it's in a way, it's very similar, you know, with every industry that you're trying to disrupting or changing, right? The very innovative companies, and I can't say, but it's a very big company in Switzerland that we're in very advanced discussions. You know, they want to work with us because they see that's the future. They have done their own consumer surveys and realized that particularly younger, more educated people, that's what they love, because it's better for me, it's better for the planet, we don't hurt anyone, it's green, it's sustainable. So that's the only thing they want, right? But there's more credibility if, for instance, I don't know, in the case of Switzerland, an Emmy comes with that and labels something like, you know, there's a traditional cheese, there's a plant-based cheese, and there's the version in the middle, which is animal-free cheese. And it'll taste like the cheese that you love from Emmy, but it will come without animals. So we believe with a larger, reputable B2B partnerships all around the world, which we are in very advanced discussions with, that will accelerate consumer adoption, because you have a trust to the brand. The company as such can position itself as very innovatively in terms of coming up something into the market, being first. And again, while it might not be relevant for 100% of users, the early adopters, like the first electric car buyers, who will just want to try it, they'll tell their friends, they realize it's actually amazingly delicious and healthier and better. So that will drive adoption over time, we believe.
Very interestingly, that's as you mentioned, with the cheese industry, most likely today the technology is already part of the cheese that you eat, even though the milk is coming from the cow still, but the rennet is already adopted with your precision fermentation technology. A quick reminder to all the participants of this webinar, please, if you have any questions that you want to ask to Jan, please use the chat function in your Zoom link. Thank you. So Jan, we have had a few more webinars before where scalability was always one of the big topics and health was one of the big topics. And of course, with scalability, that one results directly also in the question, is it affordable? Because just produce something in large scale, if it's too expensive to be adopted by the masses, does also not help. So you have a bit this triangle of technical scalability, of affordability, and of health. And where do you see your products there? You mentioned it's the same, the real thing, or even better. On the price point and on the technical scalability, how does it look like?
Yeah, so price points, we will be price parity very soon, I'd say within 5 years. And beyond that, we will be better, significantly better. And the simple reason is it's a mathematical proof, right? Like a cow converts 1% of what she eats into protein. If we get above that 1%, we'll have a more efficient way of coming to end protein, right? And that's, we absolutely believe and are convinced there's step change opportunities. How, you know, unlike the cow, we because we're constantly linked to machine learning, how to more optimally express those proteins in microorganisms. This improvement never stops. I can tell you that 6 months ago versus where we're today, we're 3 times more efficient. And in the next 6 months, we'll be again 3 times more efficient. And this is an ongoing, constant improvement process where we will be able to produce more at a lower cost, because there's no ingredients. I only need basically water, programmed microbes, and sugar but sugar is not an ingredient. Sugar is a fuel, how to get the process going. And sugar is one of the cheapest fuels you can imagine, right? So that's this. Look, scalability, of course, yes, it requires big CapEx investments, that was my point around building up the system, which we cannot do alone. So that's why, our lead investor, who is a UK public listed fund investing into cellular agriculture, they also incepted a company who is building large precision fermentation facilities all around the globe, which ultimately will cost over the next years billions of dollars. And then we can, in a capital asset light way, access those in the US, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, and so on. And yes, there might be a business case then in 7-8 years, once our valuation is at a different scale, that we also build 1 or 2 of our own just to finalize the process. But until then, I think we need to work together with the ecosystem and gradually build that, right? And look, I'd say the last point is, and I tend to upset a few people with this. What we don't consider is the real price of meat or dairy, right? If we really priced meat and dairy accordingly, which means we priced it including the GST, which I think from memory, Switzerland has a GST, but on meat, but it's probably one of the very, very few countries in the world, right? There's no GST in Australia. There's no land tax. There's no carbon tax. There's massive subsidies from government. If you really do a fair price comparison against any other consumer good, then meat, for example, in Australia would be double the price. And similar to dairy. But it is, of course, a sensitive topic, right? Because there's a lot of farmers, there's a lot of traditions, those are voters, which government wants to upset those voters. So it is this tension between, on one hand, there's a need to reduce carbon significantly, and animal agriculture is a great driver of that. But then there's, of course, this, we're basically significantly underpricing it with a lot of incentives and not pricing the negative externalities accordingly. So I think that'll be a very interesting process, right? But look, I'm optimist. Tesla makes a huge amount of profit from the European Union so-called ESG carbon credits, because the European Union said, well, for every electric car you're going to buy, you're taking so much and so much carbon out. So we're going to incentivize you to do so. And in a way, in the next 10 years, something similar should happen in animal agriculture, which then will be an additional boost that should drive more consumer behavior.
I think the Tesla example, I like it very much because, of course, Tesla came from the country of the biggest gas guzzlers on the planet, where a big block is always better than a small block. I think you are producing milk, animal-free milk, in a country that has a very strong dairy production.
That is the biggest. Australia and New Zealand are the biggest dairy exporters in the world towards Asia, of course, China, Japan, right? So that as such, we have at home a very interesting situation.
Yes, I guess you will have some very interesting discussions there, and of course also to defend your stand on it, not only making friends with it, but of course you're at a spot where people definitely understand that industry by heart. We have one question by Katja Fink, and Katja, thank you for the question. She's asking about how the fat is being produced that goes into the cheese, and that is part, of course, of your milk, and what is the source of that fat? So how can you make then the transition, sugar, then your microorganisms, and then the fat content in it?
Great question, Katja. She understands everything. So look, we currently, if you look at milk proteins, 95% of milk proteins, 7 proteins. We can replicate all the 7 proteins: whey protein, lactoferrin, caseins. And then there are the fats. In the beginning, we'll use a bridge of fats from plants. But clearly, in the future, we can make fats through precision fermentation as well, right? There's a company in Australia who we're working with who are working on fats. We have their prototypes. We could do it in-house as well. So it's all, again, it's nothing will happen immediately in the first kind of releases, right? But in a 5-year horizon, we can make fats through exactly the same process.
Very good. Then we have another question from Christina Frieder. Thank you, Christina. She's asking about the sugar, because you mentioned the sugar is the new fuel of what you're producing. And of course, there are different ways of how you can produce sugar. There are, again, sugar production ways with a lot of land and water use. There are,
Yep.
on the other hand, new modern recycling approaches, like you take some waste wood and then process it into sugar. What's your take on the sugar that you need?
The name of the company is All G, and that stands for all good, right? And we really want to be all good in the entire. We want to be all good to consumers. Obviously we're a climate tech or sustainability company, so clearly the next generation of food has to be all good also to all our supply sources. So clearly we're going for the most sustainable sugar sources. We're considering how can we make the whole precision fermentation plant powered from solar energy. And how can there's a remaining biomass which can be reused for agriculture. So there's literally zero waste, right? So we're really considering every step in the process. So there's a very clear, it's not only the end consumer product, but all the steps in the process that can become game changers in terms of a more sustainable way of producing those.
So I see that circular economy aspects are definitely part of your bigger thoughts about where the industry will be going. We have another question from the audience from Poltak Hotradero. And Poltak is asking about food is another form of energy. Is there any potential breakthrough on synthetic biology on a new energy source? Or maybe something that can be utilized to combat greenhouse emissions? Or is there any cold fusion miracle in what you're doing?
I'm not a scientist. I'm very lucky to employ, I think, 35 PhDs. We had today a seminar from one of the most famous professors in the world. For 3 hours, I was like Alice in Wonderland because I realized how complex it all is what we're doing. So I'm not the expert. But what I do say is we think of this as a platform technology, and I was before that in digital tech, and as many of you would be familiar with platform, right? And really reproducing dairy is wave one, which will keep us busy for the next 5-7 years, but we can build up a whole library and toolkit of basically, it comes down to what's the business case for the molecule. So there's multiple other products or dimensions that we can create, right? Either existing products like eggs and so on, but also, and that's, I think, the more interesting thinking, we can create novel, basically better versions of food. Like if you go to a supermarket 50 years ago and look at what you were finding in the different shelves, and if you look at it today, you didn't find 50 years ago things like energy drinks or things like energy bars or certain more organic types of food, and so on and so on and so on. And I think this evolves, right? And clearly, we want to use this technology to create clear additional consumer benefits with something that is healthier for you, right? Because we can engineer it. We don't depend on what the soil gives us. We can create whatever is best for the consumer: higher protein intake, better digestibility, better so many different dimensions. So that's certainly the next wave of innovation. What we can do is very, very bright.
It's very exciting. So all the good without the bad. So this gives us hope for a better future. We are already very much advanced in time. So please let me ask you one last question from my side. Tell us a little bit more about you and about your passion in what you're doing. You're a serial entrepreneur, very successful. And of course, you are now working on a very hot topic on making the future of food more sustainable and more healthy. What is driving you, and where do you get your energy from that is needed for all the hard work that you do?
Tom, you know it, right? You're an entrepreneur yourself. So it's not my first company. It's the third company. It's always, to those of you considering becoming an entrepreneur, it is on one hand much harder than you think, because you read the headlines about the fundings and the breakthroughs, and that's the top 0.1% of the iceberg. You don't see the other 99% of daily hustle and lots of disappointments. That's, I'd say, one thing. But I think it is absolutely important that what you do, it is your purpose. It is very strongly linked to as a source of your energy and almost, I'd say, calling, right? And I was very lucky that 2.5 years ago, I listed the first company. Was on a plane literally in the US, where myself as a vegetarian, it's not the most vegetarian friendly country. And on the plane back, I was thinking like, well, what do I do next? This really was a very annoying experience here, those 2 weeks, and started to research the space and realized actually what kind of a problem it is really for humanity and source of a climate change, as well as a very unjust food system for animals, for people, for workers, and so on, and dig deeper and realize, well, that I can really create a huge multi-billion-dollar company that will only create good, and that gets me going every day, right? And I think you need that, and that's my passion, you know, where I can combine passion with probably capabilities, but there's so many talented people on the call where you have your own passion, and I think it is very important to find this, because once you do, then you'll know that's your thing, and that will get you going for the next 10, 15 years, whatever might be necessary to make it big.
That's a wonderful conclusion. Thank you so much, Jan, for taking your time today and sharing with us your insights and your passion and your purpose in what you're doing. And we are very much looking forward to where your company will go from here. And of course, once we see the products on the shelf, probably here in Singapore, hopefully very soon.
Very soon.
And I also want to say a big thank you to the active participants of today's webinar. Thank you for all the good questions asked, and thank you so much for organizing this webinar, Patricia and Tony in Switzerland. Please look out for our upcoming next webinar in this series with food technology experts and industry players. The next one is scheduled for the 2nd of March with Thomas Hauser from Nestle. So we will then switch from innovative startup today to a big corporate, and it will be very interesting to listen to them and see what are they working on these days. So thank you everyone for being part of today's webinar. I wish you all a wonderful weekend ahead, and see you soon.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you everyone.